Alright, in this video, first I just want to show you what I've done since the last video. I created a level 2, and don't worry, I'm going to show you details how I did this, but I just want to quickly walk through this. I created another scene, so in my scenes folder I've got a separate scene. I just copied the main scene, and then I did some modifications. And now I have the spawn manager script attached to the enemy block, so it's spawning. And I'll just run it to go ahead and show you what it does. So when I run this, you're going to see 7 enemies created on the screen, and I had to change the amount of movement because now it doesn't go as far, can't go as far because of the fact that there's 7 instead of only 5. And then notice when I come down, it hits the player and destroys it once it hits them. So let's see here now. How did I create these guys as a part? Oh, the other thing I forgot to point out when I ran it was watch how now the enemy block, this game object with the arrows turned on here because I have the arrows move tool selected. See how it's moving? So that's how you know. And also when it runs, where are the enemy ships? Well, they're a component of the enemy block. So that's really important. Every so often it glitches out and it just moves down really fast. I'll have to look at that later, but right now just want to point out that the enemy ships are created as what we call child of the enemy block game object. And so every time we run it, like when we're not running, you don't see any arrow because there's nothing underneath, there's no children. But every time I run it, you'll see an arrow pops up, and these enemy ships are created as children of the enemy block. And that's really important because otherwise the spawn manager and the enemy controller, the enemy controller that's controlling this enemy block wouldn't control all of the ships if they weren't a child of. Alright, so how did I get here? First thing I did was I'm sitting in my main scene, which was where I manually dragged and duplicated these ships and manually dragged them around. I wanted the spawn manager to create these. That way when we have multiple levels, you can have it spawn, and it's just more efficient from a programming perspective. So what did I do? I first just did a file, save as, and underneath my assets folder there's my scenes folder. I opened up my scenes and I just typed in level 2 scene, and then I saved that. I'm not going to save because I already have one. I'm going to open mine up. Alright, so now I know that I'm in level 2 scene. It says it right here. And then basically it duplicates. So then I had to open up my enemy block and I deleted all of those enemy ships. Then I went to the prefab for my enemy ship and I took off the script that was controlling them as individuals. Actually, I didn't have that on those.
Lucas, Weber, Logan, Duncan, please come to the admin office.
So actually, this is all we need is the detect collision on the enemy ship, because the enemy block is going to have the spawn manager and the enemy controller on it. Alright, so let's go back to, let's see, once those are deleted, we're going to have to go look at the script for the spawn manager. That's going to need the most adjusting. So I open up the spawn manager script, and here's what I did. I set up some variables underneath the start method. I got my XYZ, and I gave them some values. That's just so that's where they're going to be created on the screen. And so here's my instantiate code that you guys all have, and then here's the X position, the Y position, and the Z position. Now we put this in a for loop where I is the variable that's being incremented. I ++ means increment by 1. So it starts off at 0, and it goes to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Because once it hits 7, that's breaks this rule, so therefore then it kicks you out of the loop. So this for loop is intended to do from 0 to 6, which is 7 spaceships, And my X position, so that'd be left and right, I started off at a -3 because if I went -3, increment by 1, right here it increments by 1, then it's -2, then -1, then 0, then 1, and 2, and then 3. And there's the full 7 objects, starting from -3 going all the way to +3. And just to refresh that, I'll show you when I hit play. There they are. -3 was this one, +3 was this guy, the middle was 0. Alright. And then, now, how did I figure out, what I was having trouble at first was when I got this to instantiate, when I just had this code in this for loop, it wasn't putting the enemies, our new game objects, as a child of the enemy block. It was just putting them underneath, and then they weren't following the enemy controller because I had that applied to this guy. And then I had to apply enemy controller to each one of those in order for, I had to apply it to the prefab in order for it to work. But it's much better, more efficient if we do it this way, where we apply the enemy controller to the entire enemy block. So, how did I get that to work? And how did I get them to be spawned as a child of enemy block? I simply went online. I'm going to show you the website. I typed in C# code spawn as child of. And the first link I got, this guy was saying that he had troubles. He couldn't get it to work. And this guy was answering. But then this guy said, oh, this didn't work for him. And then here was the fix. Created a variable game object. He named it Go. Then he instantiates his prefab. And then you needed this code, go.transform.parent, so that it sets it as a child of. And it makes the parent that you're instantiating this in the parent. So I took this code, copied it. Oops, excuse me, I went down here and I actually used this guy's because it's very similar. But this one added this after it, and that worked better. So anyway, I just took this guy, copied this, and here we are, instantiate prefab. So you'll see I have this code, but in here I have my instantiate code. That's this. There's my instantiate code. But I used game object. So I'm creating a variable named game object, or named obj, a variable. Then I apply a game object, but I named it obj. obj.transform parent equals transform. So that's the same code he had. So basically, that's where I got this code from, and that made it work. That made it create as a child. Alright, and then one more thing that I modified was in the code, the enemy controller, because I went with 7, instead of 5, I had to change my range, the X range, where it's movement. So now I only have it moving 1.5 to the left and 1.5 to the right. And so that's, that's this guy. So now when it's less than 1.5 from wherever it starts at, then it turns around. Gives it a speed of -1. Then when it's further right than 1.5 of where it started, it turns it around in the speed. And then these guys, as I think I said in the last video, that's just getting it to move down the screen. We said z-1, z-1 for each of those. It just moves the z value down 1, decreases it by 1. You can play around with that. Mine is 1 right now, which is a pretty significant jump down the screen. If you want it to move slower down the screen, we can move it to a 0.5. Oops. And if we did that, hit save. Oops. If I'm going to do a 0.5, almost forgot, we got to make sure it's a float because it's not an integer. And we need to put a 0 and put an F after it. Alright. And then when I play, there we go. And now it should come down a little bit slower. It only increments by a half instead of a full. And then I want to show you that this still works. And watch, when I hit the edge ones, notice it doesn't go all the way to the edge now because it's the entire block moving. And that's what I wanted. And does it still work? It still kills the enemy, or kills the player if it hits him. Alright, good. And that's it for that step. Then the other thing I want you guys to try to work on is, in your spawn manager, come up with another for loop where this is all nested underneath it. This is all indented in, and then you have another for loop above it so that you could have multiple rows. This just creates one row going across, making 7. But I'd like to see you guys make at least 2 rows. What does that mean? If you had to have another for loop, and this is nested underneath that for loop. And so the for loop might, if it's going to be from 0 to 2 maybe. So it'd be 0, 1. And that would put in 2 rows. If it was 0, 3, that would put in 3 rows. 0, 4, that would put in 4 rows, and so forth. See if you can get that to work so that when it builds, when it spawns the enemies, you have more than 1 row. Alright.